For having us. My name's Tim Cubitt. I'm from the Australian Institute of Criminology. How's that? All good? All right. Can you hear me? Can anyone put yep, awesome. Back in November 2022, the AIC launched a large-scale survey. Still ringing. Okay. Should I use a mic? Is that going to be easier?
Can we turn that one off?
Okay.
Quite aggressive.
Yes. All right. Bear with me. So back in November 2022, the AIC launched a very large-scale survey of the Australian community. We wanted to cover a large range of topics, but broadly the focus was on radicalisation and the certain different factors within the community. We surveyed a little over 13,000 people as part of this survey. The subject matter that we covered were internet and technology use, life events, personality and mental health, fringe and radical content and access to it, groups, online groups and engagement with those groups, political beliefs and conspiratorial views among these individuals. So we launched this survey, a large-scale panel survey. We procured a panel provider to take this survey to a large cross-section of the Australian community. And then we followed up with online qualitative interviews of 31 individuals who had been involved in anti-government protest across the COVID period. Specifically, we asked them about their motivations, their experiences, the outcomes of being involved in protest activity, specifically in response to COVID. During that data collection, we received responses from some people who were involved in other types of protest activity during that time. We set them aside. I'm not going to talk about them during this presentation. I'm going to focus on something entirely different. So to give you a brief idea of the people who we surveyed, this was a proportional quota sampling methodology. So we sampled proportionally to the age, sex, and location of residence distribution based on ABS statistics. Broadly speaking, we had representation from every jurisdiction in Australia, and that were stratified by their age, sex, and location of residence. All of that is to say that we obtained a representative sample of the community. We can't give prevalence estimates in the same way that some studies can give, but what we can broadly talk about are the trends, kind of a quasi-prevalence estimate. And as you can see here, the sample was representative of the spread of the Australian population in terms of location and key population demographics. I've harped on about that 3 times. I just wanted to get it in your heads that this was broadly representative of our community. And what you can see here is the distribution of the sample. And because it was such a large sample, more than 13,000 people, we had really good representation from across demographic characteristics. So across age groups, gender distribution, representation from individuals born outside of Australia, education level, employment, and remoteness. We had these characteristics within the sample, so we felt really comfortable about having a cross-section of the community. What I'm going to discuss is their exposure to and their tendency to share fringe and radical content that they've experienced, they've encountered online, their engagement with groups, and as a bit of a content warning, I will touch on child sexual abuse material towards the back end of the presentation. My colleagues will then go into the relationship that this kind of content can have in support for violence, and then the role of conspiratorial views as well. So last year, we presented here at this conference about our findings that I touched on before about participation in anti-authority protests and vulnerability to radicalisation. In that research, we used a systematic view by Michael Wolfowitz and measured the prevalence of radicalisation risk factors, protective factors within the community, and the relationship, the vulnerability of individuals who attended anti-authority protests to radicalise. We also, grievances and conspiracy theories, we measured these in our qualitative sample, asked about the motivations to become involved in those types of protests. Those are both online. This study has been published today. So this is a separate study out of the same survey. That QR code will take you to it. A little bit of a pitch. We have started embedding survey experiments into our surveys. So this was a split ballot survey experiment where we wanted to see the effect of conspiratorial views on the support for different types of protests. And long story short, there was a significant relationship between holding conspiratorial views and support for violent protests. I recommend, if you're interested, to go to that QR code, see a few people still with it. That was about as much as I had to say on that slide, so I'll give you another second. All right, up on the ARC website. So as part of this survey, one of the questions that we asked was, in the last 12 months, have you seen political, ideological, or religious content online that mainstream society or government might describe as fringe, unorthodox, or radical? Bit of a mouthful, but what we found was that almost half of the sample had been exposed at some time. They had seen fringe or radical content online. As part of that question, we gave a series of examples of what we might consider to be fringe and radical, things like manifestos, sermons, things like this that people might, the government or other individuals might describe as fringe or radical. Among those 45.9% who had seen the content, about 30% said it depicted violence. About 1/4 said they'd accessed the content intentionally, so they'd gone and sought it out rather than being encountering it as they were looking for something else. And 12.7% said they'd shared it with other internet users. So some unintentional exposure, and we heard Michelle speak before about Facebook. You're going to hear me say the word Facebook a couple of times in this. Some unintentional exposure was likely due to more frequent use of mainstream social media. That's going to be the case. Using kind of a mainstream, very, very well represented social media source will cause exposure to types of content that their algorithms, their selection process for getting rid of that content has missed. This slide shows the at least weekly use of mainstream social media platforms. Among those who had not seen radical content, in the darker green, those who had viewed radical content unintentionally, and those who had viewed the content intentionally. What you'll see, just to quickly point out, is that the trend changes when we get to Twitter. So those who had viewed the content intentionally, those who had gone and sorted out, the trend line, if we were to draw a line, was marginally higher among those who had sorted out. They went to Twitter. This, just as a side note, this is Twitter before the Elon Musk saga. This is late 2022. So we'll touch on this later on, but this is a repeat cross-sectional survey. So we're repeating this survey currently with similar questions. I'm really interested to see what this looks like now that kind of Twitter has become slightly different as well. On the topic of encrypted communications, respondents who intentionally access the content were more likely to use Telegram, but frequent use was still uncommon. So again, this is at least weekly use of encrypted communications platforms among the same groups. Obviously, the most common use was WhatsApp across all of the groups. But when we got to platforms like Signal or Telegram, those who intentionally accessed it, they were more likely to use those groups than they were more likely to use those platforms than the other groups. So we asked why people were intentionally accessing the content. So just specifically among those who actually went and sought the content out, why they did that. Most commonly, they reported that it was because it aligned with their worldview. 55.6% said it was to learn more about the cause. They've been following the topic, or they shared some values with the content. A little over 26% said they were curious. It was for entertainment or because they encountered it while browsing. And 16.5% said the government or media are biased and engage in manipulation or propaganda, and they wanted to fact check it. So they went and sought that content out. We then asked what the aim of the content was. So what respondents believed was the content that they'd viewed, what that content was intending to do. The majority, 2/3 of the sample, said it was for information or the discussion of ideas. News and current events was common, but about 40% said that it was a call to action. Entertainment, financing or donations. But what I want to point out in this slide is that 1 in 10 said that it was for planning or executing actions, and about 1 in 10 again said that it was calling for violence against others. This presentation is kind of laying the groundwork. I'm not going to go into the cause for violence or the relationship with violence. I'm talking about the respondent prevalence. I'll leave that for my colleague Anthony. Really importantly, there was a relationship between online and offline networks. So this slide talks about the proportion of respondents whose immediate family and friends were known to access the same types of content. So among those who viewed it unintentionally, a relatively small proportion of friends, seen in the darker green, and family in the lighter, accessed the content as well. But among those who had intentionally sought it out, family and friends were more likely to access the content as well. So there was a relationship between people who were known offline to people who were responding to the survey. Then we asked about sharing the content. So once they'd seen it, the conversion to going on and sending it to someone else, where individuals were most likely to share radical content. This is the most used platform. So obviously there might be multiple platforms. These are the platforms that were most used to share the content. And again, we see around a third responded that it was Facebook, the most used platform relatively far. But I'll also just point out that about 2.5%, this question always comes up, what about sharing the content offline? What about taking online content, giving it to someone else? So about 2.5% said that when they shared it, it was most likely to be an offline method of sharing. We can also see through the middle there, encrypted communications platforms were present, but by far and away, mainstream social media was used to share the content. So then we asked whether our respondents had encountered online groups, communities, servers, clubs, or forums that, same language, mainstream society or the government might describe as fringe or radical, with some examples in there as well to direct our respondents. We wanted to know whether individuals were encountering these groups disproportionately because they were intentionally looking for the content, whether they were hanging out on certain places online and they were encountering the groups. Environmental approach that we've talked about a bit today. So this is the proportion of the sample who encountered and participated in online groups promoting fringe or radical views. So this is of the 13,300 individuals who we surveyed, 11.8% encountered a group of this type online. That's a really lot. That's a large number. I think it's fair to say that we didn't think would be that high. It was quite high. 3.9% accessed a group intentionally, and 2.6% said that they had they reported being a member of that group or considering themselves to be a member of a group of this type. So breaking that down a little bit further, among those who encountered these groups, the conversion rate to joining them was really high, much higher than we thought it would be. The proportion of respondents who encountered the groups who went on to access, encountered the groups who went on to access or join these groups. On the left, we can see 33% of individuals who encountered a group of this type went on to intentionally access it, to gain access to those groups, whether it was applying through Facebook, through another online method to get access to the group. But then a quarter of these people said that they were a member of a group of this type. That's a really high number, I think. At least for me, maybe someone else in the group has a better knowledge of it, but it's higher than we suspected it would be. What I want to impress on you here is that the conversion was really high. Once these groups were encountered, the likelihood of becoming a member is more likely than we expected. So those who intentionally sought out fringe or radical content online and joined these online groups tended to act as brokers of the content. This is where we started to see the development of distribution networks for online fringe or radical content. So in this chart, we see the proportion of respondents who intentionally accessed fringe or radical content and that went on to share it. So those who joined a fringe or radical group online, more than 2/3 of them said that they then took content and shared it to someone who wasn't a member of that group. So we've labeled these as brokers. That term comes from other areas of research where people broker relationships between one another. We're referring to, in this context, people joining groups and accessing fringe or radical content and brokering a relationship with those who aren't members of those groups and sharing that content onto others. But this relationship wasn't exclusive of those who had joined those groups. Among those who had not joined a fringe or radical group, 27.7% still brokered content onto others. So they didn't consider themselves to be members of a group, an online group that was propagating this type of content, yet they still obtained the content that they saw and shared it onto other individuals. And again, the platform that was most commonly used to access a group promoting fringe or radical views, regardless of the manner in which respondents viewed or shared fringe or radical content, was Facebook. This is a point in time estimate, November 2022. There is a chance that I'm standing here speaking to you now, that environment has changed. I think that this finding will probably hold, but there is a chance that it may have changed slightly, and that's why we have a survey in the field of roughly a similar number of respondents that we'll be able to speak to once the data comes in. So I said that I would mention or touch on towards the end child sexual abuse material. So as another component of our survey, we asked individuals or respondents whether in the last year they'd encountered sexually explicit material of people who are or look underage, under the age of 18, online, whether unintentionally or otherwise. So we wanted to know about the intersection between people who are accessing fringe and radical content and people who are accessing child sexual abuse material. We wanted to know who had viewed both, one or the other, or both. So respondents who had viewed child sexual abuse material or fringe or radical content in the last 12 months, this chart shows that about 1.1% responded that they had viewed child sexual abuse material, but not fringe or radical content. But 2.9% of our sample said they'd viewed both. When we broke this down, that meant that 64.7% of respondents who viewed child sexual abuse material had also viewed fringe or radical content. And then on the other hand, 7.1% of respondents who viewed fringe or radical content also viewed CSAM. And so there was a considerable overlap between these two groups. And leaning into our presentations this morning about places and online environments, there is a chance that this is because the two types of content were located in the same place. That the exposure was because they went looking for one and they happened to see the other. We don't know the directionality of that, whether people were looking for fringe or radical content and they came across CSAM, or whether they were looking for CSAM and came across fringe or radical content. That's also just a theory at the moment. We didn't have questions in there about motivation. We weren't entirely sure about the magnitude of the overlap either. But we have a paper that's in the publication process at the moment that discusses this and describes the characteristics of these individuals. They're a fairly unique group. Those who were part of the overlap group who viewed both types of content tended to have more extreme behaviors, more extreme characteristics. And what that looked like when compared with others, they tended to be younger and male, so more likely to have had contact with the justice system, especially as a juvenile. Prior military service was more common. More likely to have certain diagnosed mental health disorders. We only asked about diagnosed mental health disorders. They were less likely to use Facebook, interestingly, but more likely to use platforms like X or Twitter, Telegram, Discord, and Signal. So that's the end of my presentation. We're going to hold the questions until the end. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Anthony to talk about the relationship between viewing fringe and radical content and support for violence. So please welcome Anthony.
How much is the microphone bothering you? Because I can feel it in my teeth. Is it because I can use a handheld and move away from the lectern if people would prefer? You're okay with it? Yeah. Okay, all right, I'll keep going. It's really not this sensitive. That's all right. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks again for joining this session. Chance my mic. I'm going to basically kick off. I'm going to kick off where Tim left. So having established that exposure to fringe and radical content online is relatively common, particularly on mainstream platforms among online Australians. I'm going to explore whether this exposure is associated with increased support for violence, and particularly violence to achieve collective goals. So everyone, I think, and we've spoken about this already a lot today, I think everyone in this room will be well aware that the internet is used by violent extremists to communicate with one another and the general public, whether that's to distribute propaganda, radicalise and recruit at-risk individuals, or to raise funds and pay. Tim and some other colleagues at the ARC recently published a fairly large-scale review of, among other things, internet radicalisation. And what they showed was that exposure to extreme content and other extremists online was associated both with increased radical attitudes, but also increased likelihood of radical behaviours. And the research that they reviewed as part of that study suggested that as many as 60% of violent extremists had either radicalised primarily online or had a significant online component to their radicalisation. There's some UK research which suggests that's actually probably now closer to 90% or higher. Now, the general consensus has been that exposure to violent content is a risk factor for radical attitudes or radicalisation, but it acts more as a contributory factor rather than a root cause. But we have relatively limited Australian evidence on the problem, and the research that we do have tends to either focus on specific platforms or particular groups, especially known extremist groups. And of course, the online environment continues to evolve. And so we've seen an explosion of mis and disinformation and extreme content online that's shared by malicious actors that's reaching a much wider audience than ever before. What's concerning about this content becoming so widely available is not just the fact that it's reaching people who might otherwise never be exposed to the kind of ideas, messages, and influences. It's the spread with which, it's the speed with which this information and the communities that share it are thought to shape people's worldviews in a way that might lead them to not only hold radical beliefs, but then act upon them and engage in violence. And the problem with it happening so quickly is it makes it extremely difficult to intervene and prevent acts of violence from occurring. Now, the issue, of course, has attracted substantial attention. I'm certainly not talking about something new. And most obviously, and really part of the catalyst or the motivation for doing this work was the action taken by eSafety in response to hosting footage of Wakely Bishop Murray Emanuel being stabbed. And the eSafety Commissioner was really clear in saying that the reason they issued that removal notice and then subsequently pursued legal action when X did not comply was to prevent the footage from going viral, violent footage going viral, and potentially inciting further violence. And inflicting more harm on the Australian community. And they were particularly concerned about the impact on young people. And of course, this raises the question, to what extent does exposure to this type of content actually influence people's attitudes toward violence? And in particular, the focus I'll be talking about, their support for the use of violence to achieve collective goals. This is terrible word waste, but I'm not going to plug it. We did explore this issue last year to some extent when we presented to the event symposium last year. And this was the research that we released a few months ago, and Tim spoke to this, and I'll sort of add a little bit to that. In this research, which we undertook on behalf of the Five Eyes Law Enforcement Group, we explored the vulnerability to radicalisation among people who participate in anti-authority or anti-government protests. And there was a significant online component to this work, given the important role, obviously, that misinformation and the spread of conspiratorial beliefs have played in shaping the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviours of the people who protested. What we did as part of that study, or as part of our body of work, we compared survey respondents who had participated in an anti-government, anti-authority protest with people who had never protested, people who had protested but not recently, and people who protested in other types of, or in support of other issues and movements, so women's rights, Indigenous deaths in custody, climate change, and so on. And what we found in that study was that the anti-authority group were significantly more likely to intentionally access fringe and radical content online, and to also intentionally access fringe and radical groups. We found that they exhibited fewer protective factors and more, a larger number of risk factors, I'll talk about this shortly, for radicalised attitudes than people who didn't protest and for other protesters. And they were more likely to express the use of or support for the use of violence, and were more likely to what we term vulnerable to radicalisation, as a term.
And importantly, their online behaviour kind of forms part of a rich tapestry of factors that likely influence these attitudes. What we didn't do as part of this research is look specifically at that link between their online behaviour and their support for violence. So we didn't ask the question, how much does this exposure influence a person's attitudes relative to all the other risk and protective factors that we know influence the likelihood that someone will develop radicalised attitudes or mobilise towards violence. And so this leads me to the current study, which aims to try and understand to what extent exposure to fringe and radical content online and participation in online groups that promote fringe and radical content, to what extent are they associated with increased support for violence? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I said I was going to build on and scaffold on Tim's presentation. I think it's really important to be clear here that we didn't just measure some sort of blanket exposure to fringe and radical content without considering the different types of patterns of online behaviour and also the intent behind that online behaviour that Tim talked about as part of his presentation. So first, we measured both intentional and unintentional exposure to violent and non-violent fringe and radical content. We measured the effect of unintentional exposure, access to, and also participation in online groups. And we also measured the effect of having immediate family or friends who are also accessing fringe and radical content or were known to be accessing it. So we're not only measuring the effect of the type of content that e-safety were concerned about, but we were able to explore whether participation in online groups, so these kind of, someone mentioned echo chambers earlier today, but echo chambers that promote and reaffirm harmful beliefs and attitudes, and the degree to which other people in a person's social network, trusted social network, are also exposed to this content. And we looked at all of those in terms of their influence over someone's support for the use of violence to achieve collective goals. I'll talk about how we define and measure that as well. Now, we did use similar categories to Tim's presentation, but what we did was we created several mutually exclusive categories so that we could measure the different intent and type of exposure to both the content and groups. And we compare each group to our baseline, which in terms of content was respondents who were not exposed to fringe or radical content or who did not encounter fringe or radical groups online. I'm not going to focus specifically on it today, although there's some interesting findings around the people who didn't disclose whether they viewed or participated in these groups. And we retained them as a separate category in our analysis because we hypothesised at the time that they were probably more likely to be the people who didn't want to share what they were doing, but perhaps were more likely to have accessed fringe or radical content and may have incorporated categories. As it turns out, that was about right, but today. To measure support for violence to achieve collective goals, we use the violent extremist attitude scale, which is a fairly widely used measure of radicalised attitudes. And essentially it involves asking a person 4 questions about their willingness to encourage, endorse, condone, justify or support the use of violence to achieve political, ideological, religious, social or economic goals. And just to kind of illustrate people's responses, I've included 2 of the items on the slide. What you can see is that 33% of respondents who intentionally access fringe or radical content either agreed or strongly agreed that sometimes people have to resort to violence to defend their attitudes, defend their values, convictions or religious beliefs. And 22% agreed that it's okay to support groups that use violence to fight injustices. Now, clearly this was much higher than other respondents, including those who had intentionally accessed non-violent content who had been unintentionally exposed to either violent or non-violent content. But of course, that's not enough to conclude those things are actually related. There may be other factors that explain this relationship, including Emily spoke about the thousands of other risk and protective factors that we know are shown or have been shown to be related to someone radical or the likelihood that someone will hold radicalised attitudes. So we had to control for those in our analysis. To do this, we turned to the best contemporary evidence about what we know about these risk and protective factors, and specifically, and Tim mentioned this in his presentation, the Campbell review by Wolfowitz and colleagues, which identified over 100 risk and protective factors for radical attitudes and behaviours. And this has actually been used as a framework in international studies, particularly by colleagues at UCL, to measure vulnerability to radicalisation among community samples. It's a fairly widely used approach, and I think Emily used it actually as part of her grievance study as well, just to give it some. And we identified all of the risk and protective factors that we measured in our survey. There were over 30 that we measured as part of our study. And these fall into 5 broad domains. So socio-demographic factors, psychological and personality factors, attitudinal factors, criminogenic factors, and experiential factors. And for the analysis I'm going to present to you today, we summed the number of risk and protective factors that were present for each respondent. We do this for the kind of statistical nerds in the room. We do this to prevent overfitting. If we could have included all of these as variables in our models. That creates an issue around something called multicollinearity, where everything's kind of measuring the same thing. I just want to assure those of you who are going to complain about using a sum aggregate score that we did both, and the results that I'm presenting to you actually do hold with both approaches. We then basically take all of that information that I've just been talking to you about, and we estimate a statistical model that controls for these risk and protective factors and allows us to kind of isolate the effects of exposure to fringe and radical content online groups, and friend and family exposure to fringe and radical content. And essentially what we're doing is measuring whether those things are associated with a higher score on the violent extremist attitude scale once we've controlled for other possible explanations. And so we kind of build this model that allows us to look specifically at each of those items individually. We then ran a series of subsequent sensitivity analysis and kind of additional analysis that I'll talk to, which starts to allow us to identify whether exposure affected particular groups more than others. What we found is that after we controlled for risk and protective factors, people who had intentionally accessed fringe and radical content, particularly violent content, were significantly more likely to support the use of violence to achieve political, ideological, religious, social, or economic goals. Unintentional exposure, irrespective of the type of content that was viewed, was not associated with increased support for violence. Respondents who said they had intentionally accessed or were members of online groups promoting fringe and radical content were also significantly more likely to support violence. Again, there was no relationship between unintentional exposure to those groups and violent or radicalised attitudes. We also found there was a relationship between someone's friends having accessed this same fringe and radical content and support for violence, but no such relationship existed for family members. And we showed that respondents with more known risk factors and fewer protective factors were also more likely to support this, demonstrating why we, of course, included that in our data. So in other words, people who intentionally access fringe and radical content, people who participate in fringe and radical groups online, and people with friends who are also accessing that material are more likely to exhibit radicalised emotions. And this relationship holds even after we take into account other potential explanations. Now, this is where it gets interesting. So while intentionally accessing fringe and radical content online was associated with increased support for violence, support was highest among people who were exposed to violent content and who exhibited other or multiple other risk factors. And in fact, whether exposure had any effect depended on the presence of at least 4 other known risk factors for radicalised attitudes. And this is much like what I was saying at the beginning of the presentation. Exposure to violent content is a risk factor, but it acts more as a contributory factor rather than necessarily as a root in isolation. And so we should be most concerned then with not just about people who intentionally access violent content, but those who also demonstrate other characteristics that might increase their likelihood of developing radicalised attitudes. Now, obviously, everyone's talking about young people, and we would love to look specifically at young people, but of course, this is a survey of adults. Nevertheless, we were interested in seeing whether this effect varied according to the age of the respondents, and it did. What was surprising, though, is that while people aged 18 to 24 were the most likely to have the highest levels of support for collective violence of any respondent, their attitudes were not affected by intentional exposure to violent content. Respondents aged 25 to 34 and 35 to 49 were the only 2 age groups whose attitudes towards violence were affected by exposure to violent content. There was a conversation at the end of the panel discussion after lunch, which I think really started to tap into what we're observing here as part of that survey. That particular group who is developing those attitudes and some of the kind of explanations for why that might be in terms of some of the kind of broader dissatisfaction or feelings of marginalisation and not necessarily achieving kind of excellent economic goals. I haven't gone into detail here about how and why exposure might influence someone's attitudes towards violence. I'm going to hand it over to Siobhan to do that, who's about to talk to you about the different mechanisms that might start to explain what we're seeing in the survey data. Nevertheless, what we did find as part of it, in terms of the relationship between being a member of an online group and support for violence, was that a fairly significant proportion of that is explained by someone's belief in conspiracy theories, or what we call a kind of conspiratorial mindset. And you can imagine the type of content and ideas being shared in these groups. Tim talked about Facebook a lot. These are the kinds of groups we're talking about. And those groups absolutely act as echo chambers and are obviously particularly appealing to people with a view towards supporting conspiratorial theories. Now, the outcomes of this research need to be contextualised within the findings of the research that Tim's just shared with you. It's very clear that exposure to fringe and radical content online is common among Australian internet users. This includes content that contains acts of violence. Most exposure, though, is unintentional. There are people who intentionally view this content and who participate on online communities that frequently share this material with other internet users. And much of this takes place on mainstream social media and messaging platforms, which, as Tim showed, were by far and away the platforms most likely to be associated among a general community sample with sharing fringe and radical content. And what we've shown as part of this particular study is that there are harms associated with exposure to this content. Intentional access to violent content and participation in online groups is associated with increased support for violence. Unintentional exposure, though, isn't related to support for violence. And the relationship between intentional exposure and radicalised attitudes was conditional on there being other risk factors present. It's a relationship. There's a rich tapestry, of factors that kind of play into the development of someone's attitudes towards violence in space. Now, I want to be really clear in saying that we don't know the direction of the relationship we're talking about here. It might be that people's support for violence increases after they've been exposed to fringe and radical content, or it might be that they hold violent views or violence supporting views before they intentionally seek out this violent content, which further really only kind of further solidifies their beliefs. And equally likely or equally important is that these findings do not mean that exposure necessarily leads to violence or fraud. Nevertheless, I think our findings illustrate the importance of measures that can prevent, reduce, or counteract the effect or attraction of fringe and radical content online to people who may be vulnerable to manipulation. Now, Tim's already given this a plug, but noting the limits of a cross-sectional survey, I just want to talk about what we're doing now. We've received, and we're very grateful for SEVESC funding to repeat our survey. It's just in the final stages of fieldwork for the core survey, and we've just recently launched our longitudinal survey, our follow-up survey. So we're surveying a further 10,000 online Australians, asking very similar questions, but with several enhancements, which perhaps some of you were asked for feedback as part of the process of developing the new survey. We're very grateful, and we've made a lot of enhancements to our survey to try and capture kind of the new and emerging issues that people are talking about in the kind of radicalisation environment, as well as better measuring some of the issues that we tried to explore previously. We're also recruiting 1,500 respondents from the 2022 survey to measure individual level changes. So as well as being able to measure change in the wider community, we're also going to be able to measure the escalation or de-escalation of violence supportive attitudes amongst people who we surveyed previously in 2022, and we're focused specifically on oversampling the people who shared strong anti-government sentiment. And the important thing there is we're going to be able to actually see and try and explain what might influence their changes in attitudes and potentially also behaviour, including the role that the online environment plays. And also we're, as part of that, going to be following up with our qualitative components that will be focused on parents and also young people who have been exposed to fringe and radical content. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of add to this story and provide a little bit more nuance and detail around some of the patterns that we're observing from the 2020 survey. You can access all of our previous reports online. The research that we're talking about today is going to be released in the coming months. We're very excited about. It's all freely downloadable from the ARC website. And that's all I have to say before I pass on to Siobhan. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Anthony. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that okay? Yeah. All right, last presentation of the day. Let's do it. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful to be here today to talk to you about this study. I'm presenting on behalf of my colleagues and collaborators, Anthony and Tim. And it's a study that we're still kind of developing, which is looking at the relationships between media bias and skepticism, having a conspiratorial mindset, anti-government sentiment, and supporting violence. So, by way of background, anti-government sentiment in Australia has been growing in recent years, as I'm sure you are aware. And this is evidenced by the increase in the threat level by A0 from possible to probable, not attributing this to any specific ideology or religion, but rather citing politically motivated violence as a primary concern. Freedom for citizens to be critical of their government, as we've talked about today, is an important part of a healthy democracy. However, we're also seeing an overlap between anti-government sentiment with conspiratorial beliefs and attitudes condoning violence as a way to effect social change. Concerns are being expressed by governments around the world about threats to democratic systems, the impact of the online environment, particularly on young people, and the increasing numbers of people referred to de-radicalisation programs with mixed, unclear and unstable extremist ideologies. And while belief in a conspiracy theory is common, there is a relationship between belief in conspiracies more generally and attitudes supporting political violence. Conspiracy theories have been described as a type of glue that holds diverse extremist ideologies together. It's associated with the extreme left and the extreme right. And over recent years, this blurring or convergence of previously disparate groups through anti-government and conspiratorial ideologies has created challenges for traditional interventions due to the complex and often conflicting messaging and beliefs. In the face of these challenges, cultivating healthy skepticism and critical thinking around media content is considered more important than ever. Media literacy interventions aim to reduce the negative impact of misinformation, fringe and radical content online by fostering people to think critically about the information that they encounter. However, the relationship between media skepticism, conspiratorial beliefs, and support for violence is not straightforward and has yet, to our knowledge, has yet to be examined in Australia. So with all this in mind, we embarked on this exploratory study to look at the relationship between media bias and scrutiny, attitudes towards government or anti-government sentiment, and tendency to endorse conspiratorial beliefs, with the extent to which people justify violence in support of political, religious, or ideological goals. So this research analyses data from the same survey that we've heard about in the previous two presentations by Tim and Anthony. However, we looked at a subsample of just over 11,000 people from that larger sample that had complete data on the variables that we're interested in. Again, this slide will look familiar because Tim presented it before, but it's slightly different to the one that he presented because it is updated for our new sample, but it's mostly the same breakdown, and the point is to show you that the sample is similarly diverse and representative. So as I said, we're interested in examining relationships between having a conspiratorial mindset, media bias and skepticism, anti-government sentiment with the likelihood of having attitudes supporting violence. Media bias was measured through agreement with the statement, mainstream media reports in a biased and false manner. Social media and news skepticism were measured through agreement with a series of items describing how people critically evaluate the information that they encounter on social media, as well as how they form their opinions about news and current affairs content. The conspiracy mindset variable was measured using a total score, which reflected the extent of someone's tendency to believe in conspiracies. So this was made up of agreement with the following three statements. Secret societies control the world, big events are controlled by small groups secretly working against the rest of us, and elites use microchips to track and affect populations' behaviour. Anti-government sentiment was measured also through a total score, indicating the total amount of agreement with 3 items, reflecting the extent of a person's dissatisfaction with democracy, their perceived corruption, levels of corruption among politicians, and distrust of the electoral process, or belief that in Australian elections, votes are counted correctly and fairly. Lastly, support for violence used the same variable that Anthony was speaking about before, the 4-item violent extremist attitude scale, which measures attitudes that encourage, endorse, condone, justify, or support violence to achieve political, ideological, religious, social, or economic goals. And to look at the relationship between these things, we ran a series of regression analyses. So what did we find? Does having a conspiratorial mindset predict support for violence? Looking at the relationship between having a conspiratorial mindset and support for violence, we find there is a significant positive relationship where having a conspiratorial mindset predicts holding attitudes supportive of violence. Also, having more risk factors and being male were positively associated with support for violence. People who have more protective factors and who are older were less likely to have attitudes supporting violence. We then wanted to know, do perceptions of media bias and skepticism predict support for violence? People who say that mainstream media reports in a false and biased manner, and people who report higher levels of social media skepticism are more likely to support violence. Again, we see men more likely than women to support violence. People who report higher levels of news skepticism or news literacy and who are older are less likely to support violence. We then wanted to know whether a conspiratorial mindset mediates the relationship between thinking mainstream media is biased and media skepticism and support for violence. So a mediator in this context means how much of the relationship between media bias and skepticism and support for violence is explained by having a conspiratorial mindset. So to look at this, we use the KHB method to compare results from the first model in green, which does not consider the role of having a conspiratorial mindset, with the second model, the grey bar, which does consider the role of having a conspiratorial mindset. We can see that having a conspiratorial mindset, I'm going to say that so many times in this presentation, it explains a significant amount of the relationship between media bias and support for violence. So for those who agree that mainstream media reports in a biased and false manner, having a conspiratorial mindset reduced the magnitude of the relationship between this and supporting violence by 75%. The negative relationship between news literacy or skepticism and support for violence disappears when we consider the influence of whether or not someone has a conspiratorial mindset. This suggests that the relationship is driven primarily by having a conspiratorial mindset. So people with higher levels of news literacy may be less supportive of violence because they're actually less likely to hold conspiracy beliefs. The positive relationship between social media skepticism and support for violence actually holds after we consider the influence of having a conspiratorial mindset, suggesting that there is a positive relationship between social media skepticism and support for violence, irrespective of whether someone has a conspiratorial mindset. So how people are engaging with social media has a unique influence on their attitudes supporting violence. We then looked at the relationship between anti-government sentiment and support for violence. And basically all indicators of anti-government sentiment were positively associated with support for violence. So compared to people who are completely satisfied with democracy, people who are dissatisfied with it are more likely to support violence. People who perceive low levels of corruption, compared to people who perceive low levels of corruption among politicians, people who perceive medium or high levels of corruption among politicians are more likely to support violence. And compared to people who think votes are always counted fairly and accurately, people who think votes are sometimes or never counted fairly and accurately, or who don't know, are also more likely to support violence. Again, what happens when we consider the influence of having a conspiratorial mindset in this relationship between anti-government sentiment and support for violence? So how much of the relationship between anti-government sentiment and support for violence is explained by also having a conspiratorial mindset? As I said before, compared to people who are completely satisfied with democracy, people who are dissatisfied with democracy are more likely to support violence. And then when we consider the role of having a conspiratorial mindset, we find it explains around half of the relationship between being completely dissatisfied with democracy and supporting violence, and around 15% of the relationship between being somewhat dissatisfied with democracy and supporting violence. Compared to those who perceive low levels of corruption among politicians, there are higher levels of support for violence among those who perceive medium or high levels, and a conspiratorial mindset explains around half of the relationship here. Lastly, looking at distrust of the electoral process, people who say votes are never or sometimes counted fairly are more likely to support violence than people who say votes are always counted fairly. But when we consider the influence of having a conspiratorial mindset, the direction of this relationship changes. For people who say votes are never counted fairly, the relationship of this to support for violence, there is none. There's no relationship in. For people who say votes are sometimes counted fairly, the relationship also disappears. Now, because of this, we suspect the relationship depends on whether someone has a conspiratorial mindset. It looks like the effect of distrust of the electoral process on support for violence is conditional on another variable, which is having a conspiratorial mindset. So to look at this, we implement the model with an interaction effect. And when we include the interaction effect, it's clear that the effect of distrust on the electoral process on violence is conditional and depends on whether someone has that conspiratorial mindset. The interaction between perceptions of electoral fairness with conspiratorial beliefs on support for violence is particularly strong for people who believe that votes are sometimes counted fairly. So those that are kind of a little bit more on the fence. That's the green line at the top. This tells us that for people without a conspiracy mindset, the perception that votes are sometimes counted fairly or accurately doesn't have much impact on whether or not they support violence. But for people with a conspiratorial mindset, believing that votes are sometimes counted fairly is associated with higher levels of support for violence. This may be related to their broader views about malicious actors plotting against them or beliefs in a rigged system. So it's not just the perceptions of electoral fairness, but the combination of this with those conspiratorial beliefs and tendency to believe in conspiracies that drives support for violence, and it's especially for that sometimes group. So in summary, this work shows how powerful having a conspiratorial mindset is in relation to support for violence over and above the influence of other risk factors. A conspiratorial mindset predicts support for violence on its own, but it also explains at least half of the relationship between other indicators of extreme ideology, such as anti-government sentiment and support for violence. The relationship between distrust in the electoral process and support for violence depends entirely on having a conspiratorial mindset. The relationship between belief that mainstream media is biased and supporting violence is primarily explained by having a conspiratorial mindset. Media skepticism and the context in which this is applied, so whether on social media or towards news and current affairs content, has different relationships to support for violence when we consider the influence of conspiratorial beliefs and tendency to believe in conspiracies. Social media skepticism is related to support for violence independent of conspiratorial beliefs, whereas there was no direct relationship between news skepticism and support for violence when we considered the influence of conspiratorial beliefs. So this highlights the unique, although it was a weak, mechanism of how people engage with social media and their vulnerability to radicalisation. This work shows that the presence of conspiratorial beliefs alongside anti-government sentiment signals a higher likelihood of support for violence. And while rising anti-government sentiment around the world is concerning, without a conspiratorial mindset, it may not signal that someone has violent attitudes or intentions. The findings really highlight the critical role of conspiratorial narratives in vulnerability to radicalisation in the general population, underlying their effectiveness as a tool for extremists to spread their messages, recruit new and often unlikely followers by offering simple solutions to complex issues. Responding to conspiratorial narratives can be challenging, however, the evidence supporting effective approaches is growing. This includes the use of AI chatbots and strategic communications that focus on pre-bonking or preparing people to recognise the tactics and strategies that commonly underlie different forms of misinformation and manipulative content. Further psychological interventions such as cognitive behavioural therapy or mindfulness may be beneficial in light of evidence about the role of self-control, as Bettina Rottweiler spoke about earlier, in the relationship between conspiratorial beliefs and support for violence. The implications of these findings support furthering efforts to reduce the spread and prevalence of conspiratorial narratives, given the central role of these in the relationship between anti-government sentiment and vulnerability to violent extremism.